Our story begins with George Zanuff, a man well regarded by his neighbors for his kindness and cheerful demeanor. George owned a butcher shop called Zanuff Kitchen. One day, while taking an order from a young woman who requested 2 Zanuff salads, George found himself captivated by her beauty. Beneath his friendly exterior, however, lurked dark thoughts. He imagined chopping her up. These disturbing thoughts were rooted in a haunting past. At just 15, George had killed a classmate he was in love with. It was the most euphoric moment of my life, he had confessed. I dismembered her, and the consequence was 20 years in prison. For 2 decades, I cursed my existence. Even after my release, my parents told me, "You should have never been born." I have this urge to harm beautiful women, especially if I fall in love with them. This urge is nearly impossible to suppress, so I live in solitude. Why am I like this, I wonder? One cold, rainy evening, as George was closing his shop, he thought to himself, "I'm satisfied with the life I'm leading. I'll continue to live quietly like this for the rest of my life," or so I thought. Lost in his thoughts, he noticed a little girl sitting outside, soaked and shivering. Despite his internal struggle, he fought to keep his dark side at bay. Concerned, he asked her if she was cold. She nodded. After a brief pause, he said, "You're going to catch a cold like that. Why don't you come in?" He invited her inside, offering her a warm shower. Before she cleaned up, George noticed bruises on her body, realizing she was being abused at home. His heart ached for her. After her shower, George gave her some of his clothes, apologizing for their size. She didn't mind, and thanked him for his kindness. He asked gently, "What's your name, young lady?" "Alice," she replied softly. "Alice! What a lovely name," George said with a smile. "I'm George Zanuff, and I run the grocery store here. Do you like meat, Alice?" "Yes," Alice responded eagerly. "Well, you're in luck," George said with a grin as he finished preparing dinner. "Just a moment, here you go. It's hot, so blow on it before you eat, okay?" As Alice enjoyed the meal, George reflected on how much he liked children. Their presence helped him forget his darker nature. This little girl's sweet smile made him feel like a different person. "This is delicious," Alice said after taking a bite. "I'm glad you like it," George replied, genuinely pleased. "How old are you, little Alice?" 8, she answered. 8 years old, huh? You're so young, George remarked. "Yeah, I guess so," Alice giggled. "This old man is 38, George said with a chuckle. "Wow, mister, you're a grown-up," Alice exclaimed in awe. "You're 10 years older than Mama." George's expression softened. "You can stay here tonight, but you should go back home tomorrow. Your Mama must be worried." "She's not," Alice said quietly. "Then your Papa must be," George suggested gently. "I don't have a Papa. Mama always tells me, you should have never been born," Alice revealed sadly. George felt a pang of sorrow. He knew the pain of being unwanted and unloved by those who should care for you. "That's not true at all," George said firmly, looking into Alice's eyes. "I'm glad to have met you. Thank you for being born, Alice." Alice was overwhelmed with happiness. She had never experienced such kindness or genuine love before. George, who had been very lonely, wanted to be a good person and embraced this new daily life with Alice. He gave her all the love a father could give. The next day, George took Alice to a clothing store to buy her some new outfits. The store clerk asked who Alice was, and George explained that she would be under his care for a while. He picked out clothes for Alice, who tried them on. The clothes fit beautifully, and both George and the store clerk were impressed by how adorable Alice looked. George decided to buy the clothes, and also added a hairpin to the purchase. He explained the significance of the hairpin, which featured an iris flower. In the language of flowers, the iris symbolizes love, and he chose it because Alice was a treasure to him. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Alice hugged George tightly and thanked him profusely. From then on, George and Alice lived together as father and daughter. Each day after work, George came home to Alice, who often greeted him with surprises. One evening, she had drawn a picture of him. George was deeply touched by her effort. In that moment, Alice told George that she loved him, and he reciprocated. For the first time, Alice experienced a father's love. George marveled at this feeling, thinking, "What is this feeling? I want to protect this child and shield her from all the sadness in the world. Is this what they call love?" That night, as they prepared for bed and fell asleep, George had a disturbing dream in which he killed Alice. Horrified, he woke up distressed and determined to find a solution to control his dark impulses. The next morning, George woke Alice and suggested they go for a walk. Alice eagerly agreed, and they set off together. During the walk, Alice talked about her love for drawing and her desire to create more pictures of them. She asked George to draw a picture of her in return. George felt nervous. He had decided to take her to the police, fearing that his dark nature might harm her, and wanting to ensure her safety. He just wanted a peaceful life, but struggled to control his darker impulses. As it started to rain, George regretted not bringing an umbrella. In an innocent moment, Alice said they didn't need one, because she felt safe and warm around him. This touched George deeply, but he still wanted to take Alice to the police to ensure her safety. Suddenly, a woman called out for Alice. They turned to see Alice's mother approaching. Alice panicked and looked terrified. Her mother began yelling, demanding Alice come with her. Alice refused to leave George, but her mother grew aggressive, accusing George of being a pervert and mistreating her child. Alice defended George, insisting he had been kind and better than her mother. Her mother was shocked, but George intervened, apologizing for the situation and explaining why he had taken Alice in. He told Alice to be a good girl and return to her mother. Alice, heartbroken, followed her mother as they went their separate ways. However, as soon as Alice's mother had her daughter alone, she pushed Alice to the wet ground and began to abuse her verbally and physically. Suddenly, George appeared behind Alice's mother. A flashback revealed how Alice's mother had never shown her love, only expressing anger and abuse. Alice's mother woke up from being knocked out and realized that she was in a basement, all tied up. She saw George with a large knife in front of her. She panicked and began screaming, but George didn't give her a chance. George fully unleashed his dark side. Tormented by the realization that he had destroyed any chance for a normal life, he found himself crying and smiling simultaneously. In the end, he killed Alice's mother for what she had done to Alice. Afterward, he walked to the police station and turned himself in, detailing the crime scene and requesting that Alice be placed under police protection. The next day, news spread about George Zanuff, the man known for his kindness, who had a hidden dark side. George spent his time in prison, reflecting on his past, haunted by his mother's words, "You shouldn't have been born," and the look of betrayal and sadness in Alice's eyes. Yet he also remembered how Alice had taught him what love truly is. Years passed, and a decade later, Alice visited a prison museum. She saw a drawing of herself as a child, titled George Zanuff and Alice. In prison, a guard informed George that he had a visitor, a girl named Alice. Shocked and aged by the years, George couldn't believe Alice had come to see him. The guard escorted him to the meeting room where Alice awaited. Their reunion was filled with tears and profound emotion. George began to express his regret, saying that if they had never met, none of the tragedy would have happened. But Alice stopped him. "That's nonsense," she said. "I saw the picture you drew for me, and it moved me deeply. Life has been difficult, and I've faced many hardships, but I'm so glad to have met you. You taught me what love is. Thank you for being born." George, overwhelmed with emotion, cried harder than ever before. They talked and shared their lives. When Alice asked about his happiest memories, George, knowing it was his last day, answered without revealing his terminal status. He said his happiest memory was when Alice made him love drawing and taught him to enjoy it. As the visit came to an end, the guard informed them that the time was up. Before George left, Alice promised she would return and bring a picture of him. George, moved by this, replied that he would love to see it. As the guard led George away, he reflected on how happy he was to have seen her one last time. Knowing he was facing the death penalty that day,